So we'll start with, it's not really a karakia, but it's a taki or a chant that is used for getting the garden prepared. So, and I'll share this with Tangi Haere and the Māra, which they can share on the Facebook page. So, so let us begin. So, me taki mo te mahi Māra kai, ne? Huti huti e, ka tau e. Huti huti e, ka tau e. Tipa tipa kia pai ngā puki puki. Tupu tupu e nuku, whiti whiti e rangi. Ka hui e rongo, ka nui e rongo e. Au e tupu e. For today, I thought we would first start with a few slides just to remind us of some of the more Māori of our food crops, and then we can get into a little bit of a kōrero around some of the activity to start your Māra. So I have a PowerPoint slide up, and we'll just work through the first few just to get ourselves immersed in what are our Māori kai plants, as against just all of the general vegetables, recognising that all plants have a similar relationship with the whenua, in that what they require to achieve their life cycle comes from their relationship with the environment. So let's have a talk through that. Yeah, how do I move this one on? And I always start, and this is probably a bit selfish, this is a picture of my home, but it's also about reminding us, ko papa tuanuku te matu o ngā kai, in that the parent of all of our food, all of those things that we identify with food, sit with papa tuanuku, and it's both on land and on sea. So it's basically to position us, remind us that we are just part of that system, and how we want to grow our kai is based on our relationship with that system. From my perspective, when you're wanting to develop Māra in a contemporary space and to try and use Māra as an educational tool, we need to first understand what traditional life entailed and how we related to our Māra in that way. So in traditional times, of course, the production of kai food was for subsistence purposes and very much a seasonal lifestyle. We've moved on, you know, we now have kai available all year. We're not, it's living, we access food in different places all the time. But some of these other points still remain: a strong spiritual relationship, that relationship to whakapapa, to our resource, to our kai, to the location where we grow our kai, but also in those traditional times, they were plant-focused systems. Agriculture, as we know it now, is animal systems. So there's been a major shift in how we utilise the whenua. There were no ruminants or animal farming, not in that context. We harvested birds and fish and those proteins, but they weren't farmed as such. Storage and processing was of utmost importance because that extended our access to kai beyond the fresh sort of harvest period. The protein, as I mentioned, was fish and birds, and our land management practices were very specific, very related to crops, related to site, related to our history of how we had been successful with those crops, and not forgetting that the relationship to rongoa. But there are a number of crops that we call Māori crops, and that's the ones I guess we are interested in a little bit. In obscurity, that's those that sit in our waiata, those that sit in our kōrero, are crops like the oti. So think of te oti. The oti is the mulberry, the one that in the Pacific is used to manufacture tapa cloth. So it still grows, certainly in the northern regions, you can grow oti, but when it was brought over from the Pacific, it wasn't successful in most of the country. The other crop, which most people are unfamiliar with, is the uwhi, or the true yam. So not the yams we buy in the shops these days, those are another vegetable altogether, but the true yam looks like a kumara. And if you go to the Pacific and all of that, you'll come across uwhi, or the true yams, in the markets. The other one, which people don't realise was brought here but didn't survive, is the kuru, or the breadfruit. And in Māori, the term for breadfruit is kuru. That same term applies in Samoa and some of the other Pacific islands. Post-contact, there was a number of plants that were introduced. The hue, being one of them. The kumara, sorry, not post-contact, pre-contact. There are a number of plants that were introduced by Māori. So the hui, the kumara, the taro, the tikauka or the cabbage tree, the para, the king fern, which was harvested for its roots, puha, of course, kōkihi, the native spinach, and harakeke, and some others. So they were all plants that were used constantly prior to colonisation. And of course, since colonisation, since contact, there's these other kai, the kanga, the Indian corn, the taiawa, the Māori potato, the riwai, which is the modern potato, pokin, the pumpkin, kamo, and there's a whole lot of other crops. All of those crops introduced a new diet. They introduced a new approach to how we utilise land, suddenly growing things like peach trees, which were brought in by the missionaries. So introduced a whole change of horticulture for our people. This slide just reminds us how important these guys are. This is taken from the marae just out of Blenheim, and the carving, the relief at the base of the marae shows the taiawa, the riwai as part of their cultural sort of strength. Here, and this is what we're going to talk about a bit later, some of the key crops we're interested in. The kumara, or sweet potato. This particular variety shown here is called taputini. It's more familiar up north, but it's not pre-European, but it's a pre-commercial sweet potato. So a lot of the early introductions for kumara came with the whalers and the sealers. So they actually had an American origin. The pre-contact kumara were generally long, skinny, finger-like kumara, which were the best we had in the sense of carbohydrate crops. When these other ones were introduced, they replaced those old ones very quickly because the volume, the size of the kumara was much more, and the people preferred to get a better yield out of their crops. The kamo, which some people say that term is a transliteration of the word cucumber, but the kamo belongs to the same family as squash and pumpkins. It's a localized cross from a long time ago, so these plants are very easily crossed, and the kamo was one that's been picked up and grown on locally in New Zealand. And of course, in the last few years, it's become more familiar in the market as well. The kōkihi, the New Zealand spinach. This is the only real native New Zealand plant that has made it onto the international food stage. When Cook came, they used this plant to give to the sailors for scurvy, so they were lacking vitamin C, and they looked for green vegetables, and this was the familiarity. So this plant was utilized to improve the health of the sailors, and of course they took back seed, and this plant has been introduced to other parts of the world. If you go to Israel or Mexico, you'll find kōkihi being grown by the acre, by the hectare, for the market. We don't do it here, we only grow it locally, but internationally it's quite a familiar crop. I also got on this slide the kauka, the so-called cabbage tree, because it has several uses, but as a vegetable, it's very familiar to many people. And this was a plant that has been moved across the Pacific, so it was introduced through the migrations into our landscape. The kāinga, or the Indian corn, comes in many colours. In the picture you'll see the reds, but you have greys and the whites and all the different kāinga, some of them with their own names by location. But the origin of corn, or Indian corn, is the Central America and the hot, dry climates. When this was introduced, Cook was the first one to introduce corn to Māori. He taught them how to plant it, but he didn't teach them how to process it, how to harvest and process. And of course, they had never really grown too many crops from kernels, from seed. So they let it grow, the corn did its thing, matured, dried, became very hard. And when they went to eat it, it was too hard and they broke their teeth, so they just walked away from it. And it wasn't until several years later when Cook came back that he realised they hadn't understood the best time to eat it, or been taught when was to eat and how to process. And of course, since then, we've taught ourselves how to do the kāinga way, the fermented corn, but also other uses for it. The taiwa, which is something we do a lot of work on, the Māori potato. So these are not the modern potato. These are primarily, they're very similar to the ones in South America that are grown at altitude. But the real advantage here is these are varieties of taiwa that have been kept for generations, and we have our own kōrero, our own stories about the different varieties and how we grow them, use them, and why we keep them. This slide here shows the key varieties of taiwa that most of you may have seen at least one of them. On the top, the moi moi, and the moi moi recognised for its storage qualities, which is where the name also comes from. The top right hand side, the karuparera, with that name, you'll recognise it talks about the skin pattern, so the duck's eye. The tūtaikuri in the middle, where we are in the sort of southern part of the North Island, we call this tūtaikuri. In other parts of the country, they have other names. So urenika in the north, rahonika, maniapoto, and other names. The bottom right-hand side, the huakaroro, which I would myself say is probably the best one, certainly for a boil-up. It holds its shape and its qualities. And then lastly, the pāwhero there, which is the name recognises the skin characteristics, the lines and the cracks on the skin, but also that it's very much a good keeping whaling potato that was introduced at that time. We'll finish with a couple of other kai foods, if you like, that you'll be familiar with, but they're not necessarily for the Māra itself. The first on the left-hand side, the karingo, or if you're from the east, paringo. And of course, that's for some, it's the sea lettuce. It's the same family of plants as what's used on sushi. So where they use the dried seaweed for sushi, it's from the same group of seaweeds that makes the karingo. So it's just utilised in a different way. On the right-hand side, sorry, the piko, the fern. And if you think about asparagus, which is unopened fern, so too is the piko, it's the juvenile fronds of the fern. So it has a very similar flavour base as that. The left-hand side here, the taro, which was introduced from the Pacific. The New Zealand taro, and we've actually got some, if anybody's looking for some, which we can share one or two, is a smaller version of the taro from the Pacific one. But our main use for the taro in this country is the leaves are used as a green vegetable. And the taro itself, if it's grown in the right conditions, cool, damp, will grow all year. On the right-hand side, one just to introduce you to something new is the tohitaka, the New Zealand dandelion. You're all familiar with the introduced dandelion. We have native plants that are also of the same family. And this one here, you'll see the leaves are smaller and sharper, but they're all edible. They're all what my nan would have called all of these things puha, because they went in the pot and they were part of the boil-up. But these are all examples of the different plants that we can spend some time working with. The last couple here, the puha we're just talking about on the right-hand side, which is not a New Zealand native, it's familiar around the world, but we are probably the best utilisers of this plant. As Māori, it's a key vegetable for us. And on the left-hand side, just to finish off, the plants that we use as condiments. So they made our kai, our meals, more interesting. And this is the flour from flax, and the nectar of that flour would be harvested and held in hui as a sweetener that was used to sweeten drinks and other things. And the understanding of the harakeke is that when you have harakeke close to the coast, which actually usually gives you the best harakeke from a fibre perspective, the nectar rises and falls with the tide. So you would harvest the nectar at full tide, high tide, when there was the most in the flour, and then it would fall and come back up again on the next full tide. So they would harvest it several times during the season. Anyway, the kōrero today was to be on establishing your Māra. And, you know, it's almost the end of October, and depending where you are in the country, this is your planting season. For us, we're getting the ground prepared. We have planted some early crops because If we get our taiwa, our Māori potatoes in early, then we get them out early, Christmas time, New Year, and in doing so, we've also dodged some of the pest and disease problems that come in the summertime. So an early crop is less work to bring it through to harvest. The downside is that it's usually wet at the end of the winter and the spring, so you don't always get the right conditions to plant early. But we have ours in the same. We have the parekereke in for the kumara tipu, and they will be ready to plant probably in about 2 weeks' time. But depending where you are in the country, you may start planting them now further north because the cold period is over. Last night was pretty much the full moon. And if you come further south to us here in the Manawatu, we would probably look to be planting the kumara about the middle of November, when we're happy that the soil temperature is appropriate. And the soil needs to be about 12 or 13 degrees Celsius. When we talk about soil temperature, you can buy soil temperature probes from places like Bunnings in their garden centre, which you can use to put into the soil down to 4 inches or what have you, and read the temperature to know where it's sitting. And that is the key factor that initiates plants certainly growing from seed. So if you're planting corn, for example, then the soil needs to be about 14 degrees Celsius. And during the winter, the soil is damp and water in the soil makes it cold. When the spring comes, and after the last of the spring rains, as the soil drains off, then it starts to warm up. And it's the temperature of that soil environment that initiates the seeds to start, most seeds I should say, to start doing their thing. So understanding or knowing roughly when the soil conditions are right, it's the right time to start planting your Māra. So we are right now ready to plant. It's Labour weekend this weekend, so it's perfect timing to sort of put in your calendar for an annual sort of view of when you should get into the Māra. And for most of the country, Labour weekend would be your first big attempt at getting the Māra set for the summer. You want it in early because you want those plants to settle, to establish, and you want them to be in a good condition before the dry season comes along, because then you have to ensure that they are supported through watering or other needs. So if you're getting ready to plant a Māra, the Māra is for the school, for the pura, then really you need a combination of crops. One is if your kids are to gain from the Māra or to gain from the experience, and you need some very short season crops so that they can harvest something before the Christmas period. And obvious short season crops would be something like lettuce and spinach, those early harvest leafy crops that we harvest when they're mature in the field. So you would clearly plant some of those so that you've got something for the kids or for those involved to have before the Christmas period. If you were planting taiwa, and we've had projects in different places, you generally have to have them in a situation where they get looked after during the summer if they're planted later. So some schools had done what they call a spud in a bucket. The kids had planted their taiwa in a bucket, and the bucket needs to have holes for drainage and can be filled with compost and what have you, which meant that they could take them home during the summer break. Or you plant them early like we have, and you can have enough time to harvest something in the last couple of weeks of the term to have a kai event based on those crops. So some thought about when the crops will be ready and how you want to use them is important as you're planting. So your tasks are getting the site prepared to plant, and in a good garden you might have already done that and got the early crops planted. You don't plant everything on the same day because they all might come ready on the same day, and you don't want to plant 50 cabbages on the same day because you can't make use of 50 cabbages on the same week when they're ready for harvest. So you plant a handful of each of different vegetables so that you can spread out the harvest appropriately, and it reduces the potential waste of what comes out of the Māra. The soil has to be looked at in a longer term view. So what you grow this year is a follow on from what you grew last year. The soil is constant. That resource, you return to that same resource year after year to draw from that resource for your crops, for your sustenance. If you go back and you grow the same crop year after year after year, you're taking the same value out of that soil, the same nutrients year after year after year, and you're not necessarily supporting it for the future crops, but also if there are any pests and diseases for those crops, they stay in the soil in many cases and they come back again next year when you go back to the same crop. So you need a plan, you need a rotation of your crops. So if you have a site for your Māra, then the ideal thing is to split that site 4 ways. So basically cut it into 4, plot 1, 2, 3, and 4, and move your crops. This year plot 1 becomes next year's plot 2, becomes the following year's plot 3, and the 4th one is a rest period for the Māra. So if you create a 4-way split on your Māra, then you can support the soil, support the resource through having that that split in the thing for a rotation. And in the ideal rotation, you would move from a leafy crop to a root crop to a standing crop. So you might go 1 year from your green vegetables, your cabbages, your broccoli, your lettuces and all of that. The next year you might do potatoes or something that's a root crop. And the 3rd year you might do corn because it's a standing crop. So that creates some variety for the garden, for the Māra, and it's a very easy way to support the soil in its own way. The 4th year, you don't grow a crop to harvest, but you ensure that the soil is covered with something like mustard, which can be dug into the soil and feed it for the future years. So you give it a chance to have a rest, and you give it a chance to be fed naturally through growing the mustard or some other short season crop that you can dig in. So when you go back to that plot, you turn it over and that green crop goes into the ground. The other thing that supports all of the soil is your use of compost. So it's sort of this bit of the chicken and egg. What do you start first and where do you do first? But you should always have a compost component because you can feed back both while the crops are in the ground, but also before the crops. You can use your compost process to ensure that you're giving mixed nutrition back into the soil. And good compost might take 3 months or 4 months to develop, but good compost is the best conditioner for your soil, both to ensure good drainage, but also to make sure that the kai is there for the crop coming through. So I would encourage anybody doing a Māra to also do compost as part of their Māra activity. And you may have 2 compost bins so that when one is full, while you're letting it complete its cycle, you're starting the next compost bin. So you're moving from one to the other so that there's no waste. And so all of your waste out of the Māra can go into the compost bin, depending what that there's no sort of disease issues that might carry through. And also some of the waste from the kitchen and all of that. But we don't generally use cooked food for compost. It doesn't decompose properly or easily. We do use prunings like branches, all those sorts of things cut down to a smaller size to go into the compost itself. And we do use a mix of green waste. So not something like pure grass clippings may be useful as a layer in the compost, but you don't want too much grass clippings because it's too heavy in just one nitrogen. So we have identified we want to do the garden. We've cleared the site, and I would suggest you probably don't clear the site till after the winter, so you let it have a rest during the winter period. Come in, clear the site, And while that side is getting ready, so you clear it, turn it over, and you give it a week or two before you plant so that it can naturally be exposed to the elements, and those elements will just kill off some of the pests and that sort of thing that might sit there. You can get your seedlings ready. And in an ideal world, you would grow your own seedlings. But of course, for most people, they would source their seedlings from one of the nurseries, or one of the bigger stores. But the real value of doing a Māra is being involved from the very concept of turning the garden to the harvest and to the utility of your crop. So for most of our crops, we would grow them from seed. And growing them from seed means understanding how that seed, where it was drawn from, whether you've saved seed from last year. Say for the kamo is a really good example, or some seed, I've got some here. The seed here, I don't know if you can see it, is from the hui. And understanding the origin of that seed, the whakapapa of that seed, so that you know something about it, and recognizing that the seed contains the next generation of that crop. In this case, the hui. It contains all of the story and all of the capability for that crop to get started. Your task is to support the seed. You support it by what it needs. And in the case of the hui, in the pre-European times, they would wash it, they would put it into a kete with the fine weave and wash it for several hours in the fresh water, so that it actually got conditioned through being basically soaked in fresh water, the moving water, so it wasn't still. And that would actually prepare the seed coat for to initiate, to start to think about germinating. In that seed are the first 2 leaves of the plant. For the hui, they're called the potangaro. The first 2 leaves, it contains the baby version of those leaves, and it contains enough nutrient in the seed to support those first 2 leaves. In science terms, they're called the cotyledons. So when you plant the seed, whether you plant this in a pot so that you can get it started early because it's too cold outside, or whether you put this straight into a mound in the ground, because you would grow this very similar to kamo in a mound. You want to create the conditions that tells the seed now's the time to germinate, and to germinate in a healthy way so that the plant becomes strong. It needs temperature. We've talked about the soil temperature being just right. It needs moisture, so that soaking for a little while, ensuring that the ground is not too dry when you plant it, or the potting mix, and it needs light. So you can't bury it too deep, because then it takes longer for any influence of light. Those are the 3 main conditions. It doesn't need fertilizer, not as seed, because the kai, the nutrition, is in the seed. Give it that right environment, the seed will say to itself, now's the time. The message is time to germinate. It will germinate, it will push through those first 2 true leaves, the potangaro, and they will open up, and they will be large enough that they can utilize the sun to photosynthesize, and through that early work, they will then push up the next 2 leaves, which are called the true leaves, and the plant will start to be self-sufficient. At that point, it needs nutrition from the soil. So in the early stages, the seed has everything that it requires. Once those true leaves are up, the soil or your contribution needs to support the growth of that plant. A strong, healthy plant is the best way to deal with any problems in the field. Healthy plants withstand problems of being too dry or some pest influence and all of that. They withstand it better. So your job is to grow the healthiest plant possible as fast as it works for that plant, and let the plant establish, and they will look after themselves. You don't need to be out there every day doing management. You need to be keeping an eye from the distance, and then working on what next crop is to be planted, etc. So if you have the seed, for hui right now, we're ready to plant our hui seed this week, because I think the temperatures are about right. We will plant these, I haven't got any with me, but into the peat blocks that you can purchase from the plant shops, from Bunnings, those places. They're little round tablets of dried peat. You soak them, they become about 1 or 2 inches deep, and they're in a cotton outside, and you can plant these into the peat block. They will germinate in there. You'll get a nice set of new leaves and everything else, and then you can put the whole lot into the ground rather than actually taking it out of a pot. So the whole peat block just gets planted. The young plant likes it because there's no disturbing of their roots, and there's enough condition in that peat block to support the plant growing very fast. You just need to expose it to the right sort of temperature and light. So if you're interested in growing hui or even kamo, they don't like being shifted too much. Kamo for us are always planted directly into the ground. We don't grow them in peat blocks, because when you shift the cucurbits, which are kamo, pumpkin or squash, they sulk for a couple of weeks because you damage their young roots. Because when they initiate their roots, they have 2 types of roots. One is to hold them still, and the other ones are to look for kai in the soil. And when you take them out of pots or what have you, you generally damage the feeding ones because they're the little fine roots. So we tend to plant them directly into the ground. And those people that work in the squash crops and all of that will know that the squash are always planted directly into the ground, so that they germinate and they just get looked after directly. So, but then something like corn, the kāinga, for me, I would plant them directly into the ground, because they're strong seed, the kernels of the kāinga, and they're put in the right conditions, they will just settle themselves in very well. And transplanting them just means you lose some condition of that plant while they settle in. For taiwa, for kumara, you're not planting seed, you're planting, in horticultural language, you're planting cuttings or clonal cuttings of the parent plant. You're taking, for kumara, you're taking tipu or cuttings. They come from a parent kumara. For taiwa, you're taking the seed potatoes, they come off the parent plant. So those are technically cuttings, and cuttings don't have what the seed have. They don't have those first leaves or anything contained within them. What they do have is access to some nutrient which can force the remaining part of the cutting to grow some new leaves. So that's an alternative way of growing the crops. If I was planning ahead, we're going to have another session in another 2 or 3 weeks, but between now and the middle of November, you should aim to have most of your crops in, if not all of them, but remembering that you don't want to harvest them all at the same time, so you want to stagger your crops according to when they might be harvested, and also so that you can manage the different activities in the garden, weeding them, all that sort of thing. So making sure that you keep everything manageable. So I would be every 2 weeks, for example, planting some green crops, some kōkihi or some spinach or some lettuce and those ones, because they're the short-term crops. If you were going to grow broccoli or cauliflower or something like that, then maybe once every 3 to 4 weeks, plant some replacement ones. They hold better in the garden, so you have a longer period between crops. If you're going to grow taiwa, pokena, the pumpkin, the corn, then you're really only going to get one crop over the summer. But you can stagger your planting so that at the other end you can stagger some of your harvest. So if I was going to grow kāinga or the corn, the couple of things to remember. One is that corn pollinates through the wind. So it always gets planted a minimum of 3 rows wide, so that the pollen, when the corn comes into shedding its pollen, it moves in the wind between the plants, and that's how it pollinates. And every kernel on the corn cob has been pollinated. Where you get corn cobs with gaps, that's kernels that weren't pollinated and they didn't swell, they didn't grow. The silks, when you harvest the corn cob, the silks that come out of the cob and hang off the end, they're actually what's called a pollen tube. And each one of them has taken a grain of pollen from the wind down to the kernel that it connects to and pollinated it. So the corn has to be a minimum of 3 rows wide, and so it allows the wind to move the pollen around. But also you keep one variety in one place because it's wind pollinated, it can cross very easily. So if I planted white corn, the kāngama, with a sweet corn, if I planted them side by side, there's not every chance, there's a reality they will cross and you'll have a mixed cob at the end. Sweet corn is related to the kānga, is related to maize. All corn technically is maize, but it's been chosen because it has a sweet factor, a sugar factor. So it's a variety of corn that's been particularly chosen for its flavour, and it's been selected out for that purpose. If you cross it back with the kānga, which are not sweet corn, they are what we would call Indian corn. They don't have that sweet flavour, but they do have the carbohydrate. They do have the other elements that you're looking for in corn. So you want to grow more than 2 types of corn, space them out, either plant them 1 or 2 weeks apart so that they come into pollen at separate times, or make sure they're spaced far enough apart that the pollen is not mixing. So you might have corn on either side of the field, and you will reduce some of that cross. Corn, kānga, needs a good summer. That's the same as do hui, same as do the pokena and the pumpkin. To get their best yield, they need the heat of the summer. They need to be up, settled, ready to hold their fruit before the dry period of the summer, and that heat allows the plant to then improve the fruit swell, all of that sort of thing. So they need to be planted nice and early, and I would be looking at making sure corn is in most parts of the country by early to mid-November. In some parts of the country, the cooler climates, then it would be a bit later. Right down somewhere like Southland, then you may not consider growing corn. It might be easier to grow some of the other crops like Daiwa and pokena pumpkin, because your yield is more guaranteed, and you can tato share your yield from those crops with the people that grow the corn a little bit further north, the kānga. So that would be my thoughts for this period. We've got some questions which I have to find on my phone that came in before today's webinar, so we'll have a quick look at some of those questions, and we'll also open up for any questions before we finish the webinar, just in case anyone's got some burning questions to be answered. So the first question follows on from the last webinar, but also what we've just been talking about. So, is it necessary to soak the hui seeds before planting, and if so, for how long? I think we mentioned, and these are the hui seed here. The hui seed don't have a long lifespan. They're generally 1 year. So these particular ones come from this hui here, which is huge. It's about probably 2 foot tall by about 2 foot wide. And the best preparation is to make sure that they're well and truly dry, and then take them and put them into running water for a couple of hours, just to initiate that change in behavior of the seed. And then for me, I would plant them into those peat pots just to get a nice supported early start. When they're within the year old, then your chances of success should be sort of 95% of these seeds should grow. As they get older, so if you left them till the second year, then that probably drops to about 30% that are viable. So they very much, your hui from last year, if you've grown them for seed, you should very much look at replanting that seed for this year, because they don't have a long lifespan. The soaking for the water, yeah, just long enough to influence the seed coat, and then ready for the planting. We will have a few spare hui seed if we can organise some for those people that are particularly keen to grow some. They're becoming more and more popular as a crop, but also more as a utility crop, because there's so many things you can do with the fruit at the end of the day if it's dried properly. The second question was how to do a simple soil test at home. There's a couple of things about the soil. One is you can do a pH test very simply with the same pH sticks that you buy from the chemist to test your own non-soil things. So people might do pH tests for urine and that type of thing. They're little strips that you can mix some soil with the water, and then you put the strip in and you follow the colour to work out what the pH has a colour code between blue and red, moving from acid to alkaline. pH in the soil is all about creating the right conditions. Every plant has an origin, and that origin represents the ideal conditions for that plant to survive and to produce seed and to produce another generation. So if you look at, the taia with the Māori potato, the origin of those crops, the botanical origin, is in the Andean mountains of South America. The soil conditions up there sit between a pH of about 5.5 and 6. And those taia were still like that pH condition. So we try to mimic their perfect conditions. In New Zealand, our soils almost all have an influence of bush. Their history has been in bush and forest has litter that constantly goes down onto the soil and feeds back into the soil, which then goes back into the tree or the bush, and the leaf cycles back down again. So we have acid type soils that are generally somewhere between 5 and 6. So our soils are pretty consistent with what most crops like, somewhere between 5.5 and 6.5 for most crops. So the pH is generally pretty good, but for some specific crops, when you test your soil, you may need to adjust it. And the two ways of adjusting the pH to make them more alkaline, so to go to a higher number, pH 1 to 7 is acid, pH 7 is neutral, and then 7 to 14 is alkaline. To go up the numbers, you would lime your soil. And liming your soil is any product that is calcium based. So some people would use chalk. You can buy raw lime, you can buy different grades of lime, but all of that is used to raise the pH. If you're looking to do the opposite and to reduce your pH, you would use a sulfur product, because sulfur, what they call elemental sulfur, helps reduce, it's a type of acid, and it will change that pH down the scale. Both are organic, both are useful means of doing it. New Zealand soils don't generally need a major change, they just might need a minor adjustment. The biggest influence of pH that I would see on crops is when you get brassica crops that get clubroot, and that clubroot has survived in slightly acid soils, which is why you see the Chinese farmers liming a lot of their fields before they plant the crops, because if they're too acid, then the chances that clubroot will affect the roots of their crops, of their brassica crops. So to do the soil tests, those simple pH strips are useful, but otherwise you really need to look at getting a sample taken and sent away, and that generally costs about $30 or $40 for a sample to be tested at a lab like RJ Hills in Hamilton. But you would talk to people like myself or Farmlands or any of the fertiliser companies, and they would do that for you quite easily. The next question was how to balance or correct soil if too much sodium is present. Sodium is salt, effectively, and if your soils, New Zealand soils are generally not troubled by high sodium. They tend to be an issue somewhere like Australia. In those drought soils, the sodium has become more obvious, but I think also in the Pacific on some of the coastal soils that are subject to regular flooding, sodium is an issue. Normally, in New Zealand soils, if you had a high sodium reading, it's about flushing the soil. So it's really about irrigating till it's totally wet. So in other words, saturating the soil and letting it drain away. And that should pick up those salts and take it down in the soil. And it will still, you do that 2 or 3 times over a period of time, and that should flush most of that away. So that's the usual way that you would try and sort of manage the soil a little bit. But sodium, there needs to be some sodium in the soil. It's all part of the big picture. It's just about how much is enough. And again, a true soil test would give you a reading. It's fairly low, but your plants, if they're healthy, if the soil has everything else to offer, your plants will pick and choose what they need from the soil, and they will leave the sodium alone. It's only when they start to get starving and they can't access the nutrients because sodium has taken up the space in the soil that it becomes a problem. There are some plants that are reasonably comfortable in salty soils, and one of them is hibiscus. There's some crops, obica and all of that in the Pacific, which are related to the hibiscus, and they harvest them for the green leafy vegetables. They're grown in salty soils because they actually quite like it. Right, and the last question.
Oh, kia ora.
Yep.
Kia ora, Matua. So Matua, I see that question about pest, disease and weeds. We might leave that for our next webinar, but we have 2 more pārtai.
Yep.
More pārtai from our couple of our webinar attendees. And Reina from Ngāti Tūwharetoa has asked, we, in brackets tamariki, are establishing a rongoa garden at our kura on a large scale. Can we get a list of the best rongoa plants for our area? That's one of the questions. And we have another question just straight after that, Matua, and then yeah, that will be us. But we've got 2 more pārtai that we need you to answer. So that one's about the list of best rongoa plants.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, that's right. Well, the pest and disease ones, you're right. That's a big topic, and we'll leave it for another day. The rongoa, depending where you are, I would firstly talk to the regional council for the list of natives that are locally present. So in other words, those that are suited to your location, and especially with Tūwharetoa, because you've got very volcanic soils and soils that are high in the different attributes of pumice and what have you. So they have a different mix of species that are very used to that soil, depending where it is. So most of the regional councils will have environmental lists of what are the species generally found in their region, and those are the species you would look to first. And in a perfect world, you would look to sourcing seed or plant material locally so that it's representative of local parent material for those species. It means that they have become accustomed to the climate, become accustomed to the soils, and they call it genotyping, and that you grow what is grown locally. But from a managed perspective, if you're planting a garden that might include some plants in boxes and all of that, then you can add some further plants to that will generally, most plants will grow within the middle zone of New Zealand. That Tūwharetoa region, your limitation is the cold winter, and for most of our plants, they have they handle reasonably cool temperatures. You just wouldn't grow some of those subtropicals. There are some plants, for example, parataniwha, that only grow as far south as about Levin, because it's the day period and the temperature is too cold, too long south of that period. Kawakawa is another one that you hardly find south of about Kaikoura. So that's why your local council lists would be a good start. But any queries, you can come back to me and we can connect you to what we know for those regions.
Kia ora matua, tēnā koe and motu whakautu. Just a reminder, whānau, we have a Facebook group. The link is on the chat here. So if you'd like to join the group, Matua can answer your questions on the Facebook group. We've got a last question here for you, Matua, from Tania Milne in Ngāti Hine. Ka taia te whakatō kai ki Wainganui I te tarutaru, hei hoa tupu.
Paru o peru.
Can you see it on the chat? Ka taia
I have got it open. Ooh.
Ka taia te whakatō kai ki Wainganui I te tarutaru, hei hoa tupu.
I haven't got the chat open. Sorry.
Did you? Oh, yes.
Can you,
Now,
sorry.
can you hear me? Aroa mai whānau. Can you grow?
Yeah.
Can you grow amongst the weeds? The weeds, I think she's asking.
Yeah.
Hey, yeah.
And she's Ngāti Hine, which means up north, are they?
Yes. Aye.
Yeah. So they have a different set of weeds to us. But and yes and no. For any crop, the weeds are competing, not just for space, but they're competing for kai in the soil. They're competing for light. So you want to ensure that your crop becomes the dominant plant in the space. So some weeds are fine, they become almost like a mulch around the base of the crop, but you don't want the weeds to the point that they compete. Now you're talking about Ngāti Hine. Years ago we looked at a taiwa crop just out of Ngāwha, and to be fair, all we saw was weeds, but underneath those weeds there was a pretty good crop. And the old fella had taught himself over the years to keep it weed free to a certain point and then let the crop settle and just finish its cycle. So he sort of had his own style of growing it, but he still kept it weed free for the first couple of months so that the crop became the dominant plant in the system. So yes and no, but just remembering that the weeds will take from what the crop could make use of for itself. So yeah.